Think about this for a second. Tomorrow morning, millions of Americans will wake up, grab their coffee, and drive to work. When they get there, they will walk past fire exits, brightly colored hazard signs, and emergency stop buttons on the machinery. If you work in construction, you are handed a hard hat. If you work in a warehouse, you wear steel-toed boots. We are so surrounded by workplace safety rules that we don't even see them anymore. We treat them like gravity, like some ancient pillar of American life that has simply always been there. But here is something that might genuinely surprise you. For the first 194 years of its existence, the United States of America had absolutely zero federal workplace safety laws. None. No mandatory hard hats, no limits on toxic chemical exposure, no federal inspectors showing up with clipboards to make sure a factory wasn't a literal death trap. So, what actually happened if you went to work in 1890, the iron gears of a massive textile loom caught your sleeve, and it ripped your arm off? Did you get a massive lawsuit payout? Did the government step in and shut the factory down? Did the company pay your medical bills and give you a comfortable pension? The answer is darker, more brutal, and more revealing about the nature of American capitalism than most people realize. Because for the vast majority of American history, your safety was not a right. It wasn't even an expectation. If you lost an arm, the reality of what happened next would terrify you. Let me take you back to a time when going to work was the deadliest gamble you could make. In the late 1800s, America was undergoing a massive transformation. Millions of people were leaving their quiet family farms and pouring into cramped, overcrowded cities looking for a better life. At the exact same time, waves of immigrants were arriving on boats, desperate for any wage they could find. They walked straight into the teeth of the Industrial Revolution. But these new factories, steel mills, and coal mines weren't just places of employment. They were giant, unregulated meat grinders. Imagine walking into a late 19th century steel mill. The noise is absolutely deafening. There is no ventilation. The air is thick with black smoke, coal dust, and toxic fumes that burn your lungs with every single breath. You are standing just inches away from exposed, rapidly spinning gears and massive vats of molten metal. There are no guardrails. There are no emergency shutoff switches. If a massive leather drive belt snaps, it whips across the room like a blade, taking out anyone in its path. And the hours? You aren't working a cozy 9 to 5. You are working 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Fatigue was your constant companion, and when you are exhausted, surrounded by heavy machinery, you make mistakes. In the year 1913 alone, an estimated 23,000 American workers were killed on the job. Another 700,000 suffered serious injuries, crushed hands, severed legs, permanent blindness, and severe burns. To put that staggering number in perspective, that is roughly 63 people dying at work every single day. But to the industrial barons, the men building massive corporate empires, this wasn't a tragedy. It was just a minor operational hiccup, because in the cold, hard math of early American capitalism, a machine was an expensive, valuable investment. A human being was completely free to replace. So, let's return to that terrifying question. What actually happened if you lost your arm in one of these factories? Imagine the horrific moment, the scream, the blood, the agonizing pain as a massive machine crushes your limb. Today, alarms would blare, an ambulance would be called immediately, and the entire factory floor would shut down for a massive safety investigation. But in 1900, the foreman would simply order the machine to be turned off just long enough to pull you out of the gears. You wouldn't get a sterile ambulance. You would probably be carried outside by a coworker and left on the street, or thrown into the back of a horse-drawn wagon. And your job? Before your blood was even fully mopped off the factory floor, the foreman would step outside to a massive line of desperate immigrants waiting at the gates. He would point at the next man in line, and your machine would be running again within the hour. You were fired. Instantly. There was no severance pay. There was no medical insurance to cover the doctor who had to amputate the rest of your shattered arm. There was no disability pension to keep food on your family's table. If you couldn't work, you couldn't earn. And if you couldn't earn, your family faced absolute financial ruin. Many permanently injured workers ended up begging on street corners or relying on overwhelmed local charities. Now, if you are listening to this today, your first instinct is probably obvious. Just sue the company. Sue the rich factory owner who refused to put a 50-cent guardrail on the machine. It makes perfect sense, but the legal system was already 10 steps ahead of you. You wanted to sue the wealthy boss? Good luck trying that. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the courtroom was a completely rigged game. The legal system was heavily stacked in favor of the wealthy industrialists. They used 3 specific legal defenses to crush injured workers in court. Historians later gave these loopholes a very dark nickname, the Unholy Trinity. They were carefully designed to make sure the company never paid you a single dime. First, there was contributory negligence. The rule was brutally simple. If the company was 99% responsible for your severed arm because they refused to fix a broken machine, but you were just 1% at fault, maybe you slipped or looked away for a split second, you got absolutely nothing. 0. The judge would throw your case out immediately. If that didn't work, the company used the second defense, the fellow servant rule. Let's say you did everything perfectly, but the exhausted guy working right next to you accidentally bumped the lever that crushed your arm. Under this rule, the factory owner was completely off the hook. The court would say, your coworker made the mistake, go sue him instead. Of course, your coworker was exactly as broke as you were. But the cruelest trick of all was the third defense, assumption of risk. This was the ultimate corporate trap card. The court would argue that by simply accepting the job and walking through those factory doors, you already knew the work was dangerous. You accepted the risk in exchange for your daily wage. If you didn't like the danger, the judge would say, you should have just found another job somewhere else. It was a brilliant, wicked, and devastating legal trap. The Unholy Trinity made it mathematically impossible for an injured worker to win a lawsuit. But companies didn't just stop at winning in court. If a worker tragically died on the factory floor, the company had an even darker, more sinister strategy ready to deploy before the body was even cold. When a worker was killed on the job, the company's first reaction wasn't sympathy. It was damage control. Before the grieving family even found out their husband or father was dead, the corporate machinery clicked into high gear. The strategy was sickeningly simple. Blame the victim at all costs. Foremen and company supervisors would quickly clean up the accident scene. They would hide broken equipment or sweep up the dangerous oil spill that caused the fatal slip. Then, they would immediately start planting rumors. They would claim the dead worker was careless, that he had been drinking on the job, that he explicitly ignored safety orders. Since the dead man couldn't defend himself, the company controlled the entire narrative, but the cruelty didn't stop there. They knew that desperate, grieving families were incredibly vulnerable. Within hours of a fatal accident, a smooth-talking company representative would knock on the widow's door. He would offer his deepest condolences and hand her a small stack of cash, maybe $50 or $100, just enough to cover a cheap wooden coffin and keep the family fed for a few weeks. But there was always a catch. To get that funeral money, the weeping widow had to sign a piece of paper. Often, she couldn't even read English, or she was too devastated to understand the dense legal jargon. That piece of paper was a full liability release. By signing it, she permanently signed away her right to ever take the company to court. It was the perfect crime. Companies were legally bulletproof. They could maim and kill with absolute impunity, but you can only push human beings so far before the pressure explodes. And in the spring of 1911, the entire corrupt system didn't just break, it caught fire. March 25, 1911, New York City. It was late on a Saturday afternoon at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Up on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, hundreds of young immigrant women were finishing their shift, hunched over sewing machines in incredibly cramped spaces. The air was thick with cotton dust, and the floors were covered in highly flammable fabric scraps. Then, someone dropped a match or a cigarette. Within seconds, the fabric scraps caught fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Panic erupted as the young women dropped their work and sprinted for the exit doors. But when they grabbed the doorknobs, they wouldn't turn. The doors were locked from the outside. Why? Because the factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, wanted to prevent workers from stealing scraps of fabric or taking unauthorized bathroom breaks. They valued a few pennies worth of cloth over the lives of their employees. The workers were trapped in a blazing inferno. They rushed to the single, flimsy fire escape, but it quickly collapsed under their weight, sending victims plunging to their deaths. Firefighters rushed to the scene, but their ladders only reached the 6th floor. The women on the 9th floor were trapped behind windows, staring down at the street. Faced with the horrific choice of burning alive or jumping, many chose to jump. Thousands of horrified onlookers stood on the sidewalks, watching helplessly as bodies plummeted to the concrete. In just 18 minutes, 146 workers died. The public was absolutely traumatized. But the real outrage came later during the trial. The wealthy factory owners were acquitted of manslaughter. In a later civil suit, they were forced to pay a mere $75 per lost life. At the exact same time, their insurance company paid them $400 per victim. The owners literally made a profit off the deaths of 146 young women. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire proved that the current system wasn't just flawed, it was a murderous machine. The American public demanded action. Corporations realized they had a massive problem on their hands, and they needed a permanent fix. After the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, the anger in the streets was boiling over. Politicians were terrified of riots, but more importantly, the wealthy corporate bosses were starting to get genuinely nervous. They weren't suddenly growing a conscience. They were simply doing the math. As the years went on, a few clever lawyers had started to figure out how to beat that unholy trinity in court. When a worker actually managed to win a massive lawsuit, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Furthermore, bad public relations were sparking massive, violent labor strikes that cost millions of dollars and halted production. The corporations realized they needed a system that was predictable. They needed a way to cap their financial losses without actually having to spend a fortune making their factories safe. So, they helped push through a brand new legal concept in the early 1900s. It was called workers' compensation. On the surface, it sounded like a massive victory for the working class. The deal was this: if you lost an arm on the job, you no longer had to fight a hopeless legal battle. The company's insurance would automatically pay your medical bills and give you a small, guaranteed chunk of cash to live on. But there was a massive, dark twist hidden inside this new law. It was called the exclusive remedy rule. By accepting this guaranteed workers' compensation money, you permanently gave up your right to sue the company for negligence. Even if the boss intentionally removed a safety guard just to speed up production, and it directly resulted in your arm being chopped off, you could not take him to court. He was legally shielded from massive lawsuits forever. It was the ultimate corporate compromise. It completely stripped away the threat of bankrupting lawsuits. Suddenly, every single human body part had a literal, legal price tag attached to it. A lost thumb? That costs exactly this much. A blinded eye? That is worth exactly that much. Workplace safety still wasn't the priority. Human life had simply been converted into a predictable, manageable business expense. Imagine opening a catalog, but instead of shopping for tools or machinery, you are looking at a menu of human body parts. That is exactly what the new workers' compensation system created. It was called a schedule of benefits. State governments literally printed rulebooks that assigned a specific, non-negotiable cash value to every single piece of your body. The math was incredibly cold. If a machine sliced off your index finger, you might get paid for exactly 35 weeks. A lost eye? That was worth 100 weeks of partial wages. If your entire arm was ripped off at the shoulder, the state might dictate a maximum payout of 200 weeks. Once those weeks ran out, you were completely on your own, permanently disabled and left to fend for yourself. For the corporate accountants sitting in comfortable, safe offices, this was a massive victory. It removed all the guesswork. If a factory manager realized that installing a brand new safety guard system would cost $10,000, but the statistical payout for a lost hand was only $500, the decision was simple. It was mathematically cheaper to just let the workers lose their hands. The blood on the factory floor was no longer a legal crisis. It was just a regular operating expense. It became a line item on the monthly budget, right next to the cost of raw coal, machine oil, and shipping crates. Workers were still getting maimed. They were still dying. The only difference was that the company now knew exactly how much the funeral would cost in advance. But as America marched past World War II, the giant gears of the factories were no longer the only things killing people. A terrifying new enemy had entered the workplace, and this one was completely invisible. By the 1950s and 60s, the American workplace had mutated. The post-World War II industrial boom brought a massive wave of new technologies, synthetic materials, and experimental manufacturing. The threat was no longer just a spinning saw blade or a crushing iron press. The new killers were completely invisible. Workers were inhaling microscopic asbestos fibers that would slowly turn their lungs to stone. They were handling radioactive materials without a single shred of protective gear. They were breathing in toxic chemical fumes that would silently destroy their nervous systems. This was a brand new nightmare. If a machine chops off your arm, the cause is immediately obvious. But if you spend 20 years breathing in beryllium dust and suddenly drop dead of lung cancer at age 45, the company's corporate lawyers would simply shrug and blame it on your smoking habit. Workers' compensation was practically useless here. How do you put a price tag on a disease that takes 15 years to finally kill you? The individual state governments were supposed to regulate this, but they were weak, underfunded, and completely in the pockets of corporate lobbyists. If one state actually tried to pass strict safety rules, the factory owners would simply threaten to pack up and move their massive tax revenues to a neighboring state with no rules at all. It was a devastating race to the bottom. Millions of workers were being poisoned in slow motion. The national pressure was building to an absolute breaking point, and in November 1968, that breaking point finally exploded on live television. November 20th, 1968. Farmington, West Virginia. Deep underground, 99 coal miners were working a routine shift. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through the Consolidation Coal Company's No. 9 mine. The blast was so incredibly violent that it blew the top completely off the mine shaft, sending a massive plume of black smoke and debris twisting into the cold sky. 21 miners miraculously managed to scramble out of the darkness and survive, but 78 men were trapped deep inside the burning earth. In the past, mine explosions were just local, forgotten tragedies. But this time was different. This time, national television news crews rushed to the scene. For days, the entire American public sat glued to their living room television sets. They watched the black smoke billow from the ground. They watched the desperate, weeping families waiting for a miracle that would never come. Ultimately, the mine had to be sealed shut with concrete just to put out the raging fires underground. The 78 men were permanently entombed inside. The public shock quickly turned into pure, unadulterated rage. Americans watched on the evening news as company executives casually dismissed the tragedy as an unavoidable cost of doing business. The nation finally woke up. The dark realization hit everyone at once. Individual state governments could not protect them, and wealthy corporations absolutely would not. The invisible safety net they thought they had simply did not exist. If things were ever going to change, Washington, D.C. had to force them to. The Farmington disaster was the absolute final straw. The political pressure was so incredibly massive that corporate lobbyists could no longer hold back the tide. On December 29, 1970, President Richard Nixon, a man who was hardly an enemy of big business, reluctantly signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, known today simply as OSHA. It was a monumental, historic shift. For the very first time in 194 years, the federal government had the ultimate legal authority to walk right onto a factory floor, look a powerful billionaire CEO in the eye, and legally force him to protect his workers. So, the next time you go to work, take a second and look around. Look at the brightly lit fire exits. Look at the emergency stop buttons. Look at the warning labels on the chemicals you use every single day. None of those things were gifts from generous politicians. They were not handed down by kind-hearted factory owners who suddenly grew a conscience. Every single safety rule, every guardrail, and every protective mask in your workplace today is written in blood. They exist solely because millions of forgotten Americans had to lose their limbs, their lungs, and their lives just to force the system to change. If this story changed the way you look at your daily life, and you want to truly understand the hidden power structures that actually run our world, hit that subscribe button right now. We go deep into the dark machinery of history, and you won't want